Good morning. Welcome to Catalyst and our Sunday online service. I'm John Murray, lead pastor at Catalyst Vineyard Church in Ithaca, New York. And if you're with us today for the first time, we're glad you're here. And if you've been with us, we are on part 4 of a 5-part series, Shining Through. And today's message is entitled, In This Way. But before I share that message, our Catalyst worship team is going to lead us in 2 songs of worship.
Search my heart, make me yours. Take all that I am, every thought. Jesus, be my song, be my love. Wake me from my sleep, faithful one, and all my life for you, every single thing, all my love for you, every hope and dream. From my grave, hold me up with hands that hold the stars, fiery love. Oh, Holy Spirit, come light me up. Lay me down at your feet, for I have sown in tears and I washed them clean. All my life for you, every single thing, all my love. Every hope and dream, lift me from my grave, hold me up with hands that hold the stars, with fiery love.
are my shelter from the hurricane. You are my rock, you are my shade. Never changing, always the same. God, refresh me. And when my burdens are breaking me down, and the enemy's cries shake the ground, I hear your voice pierce the sound, saying I am with you. So I lift my hands to you, I lift my heart to you. Refresh me, oh God, refresh me. I raise my weakness high, in it you're glorified. Refresh me, oh God, refresh me. Oh, you are my shelter from the hurricane. You are my rock, you are my shade. Never changing, always the same. God, refresh me. And when my burdens are breaking me down, and the enemy's cries shake the ground, I hear your voice pierce the sound, saying I am with you. Oh, oh. So I lift my hands to you, I lift my heart to you. Refresh me, oh God, refresh me. I raise my weakness high, in it you're glorified. Refresh me, oh God, refresh me. Oh God, refresh me. Let the river flow down from your throne. Let it wash me now and make me whole. Lord, fill my heart and flood my soul. God, refresh me. Oh God, refresh me. I loose my hands, take control. God, let your purposes unfold. There's a greater story to be told. Oh, refresh me. Oh God, refresh me. So I lift my hands to you, I lift my heart to you. Refresh me, oh God, refresh me. I raise my weakness high, in it you're glorified. Refresh me, oh God, refresh me. I lift my hands to you, I lift my heart to you. Refresh me, oh God, refresh me. And I raise my weakness high, in it you're glorified. Refresh me, oh God, refresh me. Oh.
So if you've been with us the last 3 weeks for our Shining Through series, you know that we've been focused on what Jesus said to his disciples in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, when he said, "You are the light of the world." And then he said, "You need to let your light shine through the darkness so that there would be glory given to your Father in heaven." And we've talked about 3 things so far. We've talked about the better question we should be asking when we're in times of crisis and trouble and darkness. And we said the better question, instead of asking questions like, is Jesus returning? Is this a sign of the end times? Or is God judging America? The better question is to say, how can we help? Is to step back and say, who is at risk? What can we do? And who should we send? And then in the week 2, we talked about what is the anchor of our faith? What is the anchor of our hope when we are in these troubling times, when we are being tested? And the anchor of our hope is the resurrection of Jesus. That's what enabled the first century followers to pray for Peter to get out of prison when they realized that God could have kept him out of prison in the first place. Even though they'd also just witnessed James being martyred, they basically were willing to pray because they had an anchor of hope that was based in the resurrection of Jesus. And then last week, in message 3, we talked about the when and not if marks of a Jesus follower. In other words, what the habits of a Christ follower really look like. But today, we're going to take a look at another story that's recorded in the book of Acts. And Acts stands for action. And in this story, in Acts 27:1 through 28:14, Paul sails for Rome. And in this story, it's an amazing journey that Paul takes. And I think all of us can sort of look at this journey and put ourselves in it. Because what Paul was doing is he was pursuing a purpose. Paul's purpose was to go to Rome. Paul's purpose was to stand before Caesar in Rome as a Jewish Pharisee who had converted to being a Jesus-following Jew. And he was also a Roman citizen. And Paul wanted to be able to make his appeal to Caesar. And I'm guessing he wanted to also be able to present the good news of Jesus to Caesar. So Paul is a prisoner, is put on board a ship. And here's how Luke writes the story. He says, when the time came, we set sail for Italy. In other words, they were heading from Jerusalem to Rome. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer or a centurion named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. And it says that we left on a ship scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. And the next day, we docked at Sidon. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So things head out in a very positive direction. And Paul is on his mission. He's on his purpose to head to Rome. And all looks good. But it does say that suddenly there were some strong headwinds and things became difficult. And I think a lot of us can sort of identify that as we look back at the last 8 months and how all of a sudden in your life, things might have started to become difficult. You might have started to face some things that you weren't facing before. Maybe you were facing things like furloughs, or maybe you were facing things like owning a business that was struggling, or maybe you were facing someone in your family being affected by the pandemic that actually got the COVID-19 disease. And so in the midst of this, Paul makes this decision to go to Rome, and he suddenly begins to get some headwinds. He begins to have some things happen that make it difficult in this journey. And next it says this: keeping to the open sea, we passed along the coast, landing at Myra. There the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy, and he put us on board. We had several days of slow sailing, so things were still difficult. And after great difficulty, we finally neared Sniras, but the wind was against us. So we sailed to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel. And we can see what's happening here is Paul's course, his path, this journey that he's on. It goes from difficult to great difficult. It goes from having difficulties to having great difficulties. And then it becomes dangerous. And we can see that this thing is becoming troubling. And he said that the sailing started out slow, and then all of a sudden the wind was against us, and this thing became dangerous. And I think all of us can relate a little bit to Paul's journey. I'm sure you've been through things in life, maybe in this last year, where difficult became great difficult, or difficulty became great difficulty, and even maybe dangerous, even maybe where things became at risk that were in your plans. And reading on, it says this: Paul spoke to the ship's officers. Men, he said, I believe there's trouble ahead if we are going on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo. And remember, this was a cargo ship, and danger to our lives as well. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought that they could make it. In other words, what's happening here is Paul is warning them, saying, don't go forward. We could lose a lot. And they're saying, well, I think it looks okay. We're going to go forward. So they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength, called a northeaster, burst across the island and blew us out to sea. And I think we've all heard of a northeaster. And it's interesting because in this situation, Paul is warning them, I don't think we should go forward. I think we should dock. I think we should lay low. I don't think we should keep going here. But things got easier, and then all of a sudden there was a great typhoon. There was a northeaster that they were dealing with. And I think in our lives we can also identify with a northeaster, because to me it represents when things get sort of out of control, when bad goes to worse, and when worse goes to maybe something that could potentially be tragic. And I think all of us have felt that sense that things are getting out of control, that our plan is really not working out the way that we want it to work out. And I think that was what was happening in this journey of Paul. I mean, Paul wanted to go to Rome. He had a mission, he had a purpose, but all of a sudden there were headwinds against him. There were actually turbulent winds. There were actually an out of control type typhoon winds. And he was looking at potential catastrophes that could happen to life. And then reading on, it says this: the next day, as gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. Now remember, this is a cargo ship, and they're throwing the cargo overboard. This is not a prisoner ship. There were several prisoners. There was lots of cargo. And the terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars. And when the sun and the stars are blotted out, you can't see where you're going. They were lost. They had thrown off valuable things until all hope was gone, is what it says. And no one had eaten for a long time. And so at this point, as we pause in the scripture, we're basically at a point where this struggling has become severe. Things have gone out of control, and things are going overboard. It's almost like some of you may have experienced in the last 8 months, things going overboard. You might have experienced losses that you didn't anticipate. Maybe it's losses in the stock market. Maybe your 401k was going down. Maybe your business was failing. You know, maybe you've had vacations canceled or events canceled that you were planning on doing, family events. And all of a sudden we begin to feel like things are not in control. And I think this pandemic has certainly put us in a position of being able to sense and feel those kind of moments. A year in which you're beginning to experience losses, in which all hope could be going overboard. But in the case of Paul, his hope did not go overboard. In the case of Paul, his hope was in Jesus. His hope was in the anchor of the resurrection of Jesus. And so Paul remained calm, but everything else was in turmoil. And as we read on to sort of finally take a look at where things end, it says, finally Paul called the crew together. And he said, men, you should have listened to me in the first place. Hey guys, I said, let's chill. And you kept wanting to go forward. But then he says this, he says, but take courage. Or a better translation is take heart. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship may be lost. And so basically Paul is saying, take heart. Don't lose heart. Don't lose heart, but take heart. Paul's hope was still anchored in his faith in Jesus and the resurrection. And he was able to give something to these other people that were on board this ship that they didn't have, because many of the things that their hope was anchored to was going overboard. And so Paul shares what an angel had instructed him next. And he says this, "For last night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me." And he said this, he said, "Don't be afraid. So take courage. For I believe God," and this is Paul saying, "for I believe God, it will be just as he said." In other words, Paul is saying, I trust in God. Don't be afraid. Don't lose faith. But we will be shipwrecked on an island. In other words, he's basically prophesying what's going to happen based on what the angel revealed to him. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship, and they lowered the lifeboat. And I think we can see here that they heard what Paul said, but they didn't really attach themselves to it. They're like, this thing's going down. We got to get off of it. We got to lower the lifeboats. I mean, our life is going to end if we stay on this ship. And Paul turned to them in the midst of that turmoil that they were having, and he says this. He says to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You will die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat. Now, I don't know if you've ever experienced that in your life when you have to let something go that you realize that is not in the purpose of the plan of God. Or maybe you just had to let something go because it was destroying you or destroying somebody you love. You had to let something go. And maybe that's happened during the last 8 months. But Paul, in this situation, based on his advice to these men, is saying, don't abandon ship. Don't give up. Cut loose the lifeboats. Essentially, burn the boat. We don't want to have any other way out. And that was what he was instructing him. And then it goes on to say this. Just as the day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks," he said. In other words, it's not because we didn't have food, it's because you were so worried. You were worried sick. And then he took some bread. He gave thanks to God. And then before them, he said the Lord's thanksgiving. He basically acknowledged God right before them in testimony. And then everyone was encouraged and began to eat. All 276 of us. There were 276 people on this ship. This was not a small ship. All 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. In other words, they were throwing the food overboard at this point. And when morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline. They were somewhere that they didn't know. But they saw a bay with a beach, and they wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. In other words, getting it to a place that they could easily get to and on the island where they would be shallow enough, running it aground. So they cut off the anchors and let them to sea. And so at this point, the anchors are going off. And I don't know, again, this is to me the ultimate thing. One thing to cut off the lifeboat. One thing to cut off maybe an alternate path. But when you cut off the anchor, you basically have no other way. And that's essentially what happened in this journey that Paul's taking, his purpose that he has to go to Rome. And it says this, it says, but the next day they hit a shoal, which is a sandbar, and they ran the ship aground, but they ran it aground too soon. They were further away from the shoreline than they wanted to be. And the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the island. In other words, whether they were a prisoner or not, jump overboard and swim. And the others, those that couldn't swim, held on to planks or debris from the broken ship. And so everyone escaped safely to shore. And I love the way the NIV translation, the New International Version is for this. It says, in this way, everyone reached land safely. And it says, once we were safe on shore, we learned we were on the island of Malta, a place they'd never been. The people of the island were very kind to us. It was cold and rainy, so they built a fire to welcome us. And I just want to say this, in this way, in whose way? It was in God's way. It was God who had basically taken over this journey. It was God who was basically now running the ship himself. In other words, this journey wasn't according to Paul's plan. This journey now was according to God's plan. And it's God's plan that took Paul to the island of Malta, a place that he did not anticipate going to. And he took not only Paul, but all 276 people that were on this ship. So we would say at this point, hey, it sounds like all is good. Seems like the danger is past. Well, actually, not quite yet. It says, as Paul gathered an armful of sticks and was laying them on the fire, because they had this fire on the coastline. Everybody was getting warm. They'd come off the ship. They'd swum through the ocean. Poisonous snake, driven out by the heat, bit him, or fastened itself to his hand. And the people on the island saw it hanging from his hand. Just picture this. Paul is there with his hand in the air, and there's a venomous snake hanging from it. And they said to each other, a murderer, no doubt, justice will not permit him to live. But Paul shook off the snake into the fire and was unharmed. And people waited for him to swell up or suddenly drop dead. But when they waited a long time and saw that he wasn't harmed, they changed their minds and they said, he must be a god. They decided that he was a god. And here's the really interesting thing about this story, is that right away, in the midst of a crisis, they began asking, they began saying, is Paul being judged by God? And that might sound a little bit familiar because in the midst of this pandemic, there's been plenty of people saying, is God judging America? Or in the midst of this pandemic, there's been plenty of people saying this might be a sign of the end times. But that actually wasn't what was happening here. Paul was being bitten by a snake. And I really think this snake, in some respects, represents the enemy. I think in some respects, this is a perfect picture of how when everything seems like it's good, they'd reached the island. They were getting warm by the fire. When everything seems good, the enemy shows up and he fastens himself to our hand, basically to our labor, to what we're doing. And it tries to attack us in a sense from the inside out. And that's what poison does. It attacks us from the inside out. And it attacks us with things like lust and greed and anger and pride and bitterness and unforgiveness and jealousy. And those are the kinds of things that corrupt. Those are the poisons that the enemy tries to bring into our lives. But you know what Paul did? He shook it off. He said, I have nothing to do with you. And in that moment, the Lord Jesus Christ, I'm sure, was there with Paul on that beach as everybody was looking at him to see if he was going to fall down. But he was protected by the power of God in that moment. And once Paul got rid of the snake, it says this. It says, near the shore where we landed was an estate belonging to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us. And his father was ill with fever and dysentery. And Paul went in and he prayed for him. He actually laid hands on him. And the Spirit of God healed Publius' father. And all the other sick people on the island, when they saw that, they went to Paul and they were all healed. And as a result, we were showered with honors. And when the time came to sail, people supplied us with everything we would need for the trip. And it was 3 months after the shipwreck that we set sail. And then it says in conclusion, and so we came to Rome. And so we came to Rome, which was Paul's goal from the beginning, was to go to Rome, to stand before Caesar. That was Paul's plan. But you know what? Paul didn't plan for a revival in Malta. That was a detour God took him on that wasn't in his plan. But God took him there. And he took him there because God so loved the world that he loved the people on the island of Malta. And God brought Paul to that island to start a revival on that island. And you know what the interesting thing is that God's plan, his path, will always have the final word in our life. I mean, ultimately, God's plan will have the final word in everything that you do. And if we don't abandon ship like they wanted to on this ship, and if we're willing to go through the wind, and if we're willing to go through the waves and through the losses, the cargo being thrown overboard, the food being thrown overboard, the snake bites that were taking place, if we aren't willing to do that, we'll miss the Malta that God has for our plan. And if we don't like how we're going to Rome, we need to be willing to give God our trust so that he can show us the Malta on the way to Rome. And as we land the plane of today's message in this way, or i.e. in God's way, I want to circle back to the marks that we talked about last week. we talked about the habits of a Christ follower. And we talked about last week one in particular, and it was number one, it was when you give. And related to that habit of when you give, we said, you know what, we want to do something as a church. We want to do something as Catalyst Vineyard Church, actually something we've done the last 2 years, something that we did in 2018 and in 2019. And what we want to do is the same thing that Paul was talking about when he wrote a letter to Timothy. And it was the first letter that he wrote. And he says this, command those who are rich in this present world. And last week we said, if you make 33,000 plus, you're rich. You're in the top 1% of earners in the world. Remind them to not be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, not to put their hope in the treasure that's in their hand, which is so uncertain. And we know that from this pandemic and from the things that we've watched over the last 8 months. But to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything. And then reading on, Paul said this, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds and generous and willing to share. And in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation so that they may take hold of life that is truly life. And it's interesting. As we read this, I have to stop and have you think about this. We always tend to say, you know what, rich is the other guy. It's not me, coach. I mean, I'm not rich. But in reality, if we look at ourselves in perspective on a global basis, most of us are rich. And even those who aren't are probably near being rich. And so here's the thing. In this COVID-19 pandemic time, and despite the racial injustice that we've witnessed, despite we've seen all kinds of protests, and we've seen riots, and we've seen looting, and we've walked through a politically contentious presidential race that's actually still being contended. And in the midst of all that, I think God has called us to be the light of the world. I think God has called us to shine through the darkness of 2020. And we actually have 7 weeks left. So we started this campaign last week with 8 weeks left. We have 7 weeks left to make a difference. We have 7 weeks left to be the light of the world. And the way in which we want to do that together is that we want to give, serve, and love. And what we said this year in our 2020 Be Rich campaign, we're going to do this. We're going to give, we're going to serve, and we're going to love. And here's exactly how we're going to do that. We'll take a look at the thermometer that really shows what our goal is. We said our goal this year is a crazy goal. It's a crazy goal, $10,000. And I even said that I'd love to see an individual gift of $2,000. Last year, the best gift that we had for the 2 years prior was $1,860. So we're saying, hey, could somebody eclipse that? But could we all give something? And if you're in that rich category of 33,000 plus, I'm challenging you to consider $50. Or maybe you'd give $25 twice. Or if you're not in that category, if you just can't, give what you can. And maybe that's $25, whatever that is, give what you can. But I'd love to see everybody participate in this giving campaign as we tried to head north of where we've been the last 2 years. It's $6,725 at $8,385 in 2019 with a goal of $10,000 this year. And where's that money going to go, Coach? 100% of the money you give is going to go to one of our 3 Intersect partners. Partner number 1 is the Salvation Army, and we said the first 5,000 will go to the Salvation Army. Partner number 2 is Second Wind, and we said that the next 2,500 will go to Second Wind. And partner number 3 is New Generations. And New Generations, as we said last week, is a great example of when the believers, when the Jesus-following Gentiles that were in Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas with the gifts that they were giving all the way south to Jerusalem, a 15-day journey and a great distance. And to some degree, I think this gives us a picture of giving something outside of our community. Basically, a missionary group that has had tremendous success. They've had 1.8 million people become followers of Jesus in the last 15 years. They've had 76,000 churches planted. And they've had the kind of impact in Africa and in the places that they're ministering that has changed entire cities. And so we want to try to give anything above 7,500 to New Generations, and hopefully we'll be able to get to our goal and give them a check for 2,500. And finally, I want to leave you with 3 questions to consider related to what I shared with you today. And here's those questions. What is your Rome? What is your purpose? Have you set sail with a plan to achieve this purpose like Paul did? Number 2, have you faced difficulty, maybe even great difficulties, and maybe even danger during this pandemic? And what have you had to toss overboard? What have you had to let go of? And have you taken heart in the middle of this? Or are you beaten down? And where are you at right now in the midst of this pandemic, this last 8 months that we've experienced? Number 3, have you missed your Malta because you are focused on your Rome? In other words, you're focused on your plans and you're failing to see God's plan. Have you cut the anchors and let them to sea? In other words, are you all in? Are you giving everything? Have you let it all go? Have you cut the anchor? And you've also cut the lifeboats. And basically you've thrown everything overboard. And it reminds me of in Hebrews, where the writer of Hebrews said that we're basically supposed to cast off everything that would hinder us. Any load that we would be carrying that doesn't help us run the race. Anything that would help us not focus on Jesus, the following Jesus Christ. Anything that's like that we would get rid of it. And that's the picture we get in this journey of Paul as he heads to Rome. And so if you've not yet given to our 2020 Be Rich campaign, I encourage you to consider to do that. And it's easy to do that. All you need to do is you need to go to our Catalyst Vineyard Church Push Pay link. You can just Google it, Catalyst Vineyard Church Push Pay. You'll see our giving page. And when you select, instead of tithe and offerings, you can select Be Rich 2020, and your gift will count towards this campaign. And I just want to pray right now. Father, I pray for the journeys we're all on. I pray that we would be focused on following you and that we would be willing to let you show us in this way, in a different way than we know of, in God's way, that we would be willing to let you show us the way, Father. Just as you said you were. Jesus, you said you were the way, the truth, and the life. And I pray that in every one of our lives, we discover what it's like to follow you in your way. Amen.